Hello, CVCC World Civilizations 1. Welcome back to another exciting video in our class where I just sort of awkwardly look at a camera and talk to a class that isn't actually here at the moment. Favorite part of my week. But now, I do actually have some good news for you this week. Since I actually, with my second lesson last week, covered a little bit more than I originally intended, you only have one lesson this week. Because as you notice, we were going to cover some of the Afro-Eurasian empires besides the Assyrians and Persians. We already got to that a little bit last week. So all I have for you this time is we're just going to look at some of the other Asian empires that emerged around the same time when the Assyrians and the Persians were doing their thing. Now, as always, we'll look at start off with key terms. We're going to look at something called the Varna, the Upanishads, the Zhou dynasty, King Wu, and a huge part of China's government policy, the Mandate of Heaven. In the meantime, I also want to make sure, of course, you're aware of some more important upcoming dates. For example, your final essay thesis statements are coming up on October the 9th at 5 p.m. To be absolutely clear, the details for this assignment are located in the final essay prompt, which you can find on Blackboard in the final essay folder. You will, of course, also turn in this assignment in the final essay folder as well. If you have any further difficulties with this, please let me know, but please make sure you're checking these PowerPoints and lectures first. They typically explain where all of your assignments are located and where they need to be turned in. Your next content quiz will come up on October the 16th at 5 p.m. On that same date, quite a few of you have already done it, but please do remember that your initial office hours meeting must have been done with me by October the 16th at 5 p.m. Make sure you keep all these dates in mind, please, and let me know if you have any questions about them. In the meantime, I also want to give you a little bit of content quiz advice as well. I haven't posted the grades yet on the content quizzes, obviously, because it turns out grading for over 100 students is pretty tough, but I do still have some advice for you. As you're going through these assignments, remember, even though I don't require you to formally cite your sources, I still need you to use specific evidence from class to support your claims. This doesn't mean you can plagiarize. You can't just copy someone else's work and use it as your own just because I say you don't have to formally cite anything. All I need from you is to still let me know you're using some source and where you're getting your evidence from. You just don't have to formally cite it this time. Important idea, make sure you use specific evidence and don't give me general statements. For example, some answers I've seen on my other classes' content quizzes and a few from yours. Couple general ideas. Something like chariots were useful to the militaries of many civilizations. Irrigation allowed various civilizations to grow food. Many civilizations had theocracies. That is not very specific. Those statements could apply to essentially any civilization we've talked about, and really to many of the civilizations we are going to talk about. As I've mentioned repeatedly, I want your evidence to be as specific as possible. Your argument is much more convincing if you give me specific examples rather than just give me very general, vague statements that anyone could have essentially just made up. Get as specific as you possibly can. Also, this isn't as big of an issue, but I do just want to remind you, because some of you still did it, remember that if you answer more than the required number of questions on the quiz, it is not going to help your grade. I'm only going to grade the first questions you answer because that just makes it longer to grade if I try to cherry pick your best answers. Grading more than the required number will not help you. I recommend just finding the answers you feel the best prepared to discuss and sticking with that. Finally, please do remember if you panic about any of your grades with the content quizzes, I am going to drop your lowest quiz grade. So that should help you a little bit and make you feel a little bit better if you have a bad week. In the meantime, let's jump into the content for a little bit. The first thing I want you to do is to have this will be something you should be prepared to discuss throughout this week and will be related to some of your discussion forums in the few coming days. An Assyrian and Persian comparison. As you hopefully noticed in the last class, or last week, I tried to spend a great bit of time comparing and contrasting what Assyria and Persia were going through and how their imperial systems differed. To prepare for this, I want you to be prepared to discuss which group had the better imperial system, the Assyrians or the Persians. I'd like half of you to argue for Persia, and I'd like half of you to argue for Assyria. Like the actual debate, you can of course draw in outside examples and evidence to support your argument, but the bulk of it should come from analyzing the topic and things from class. Be prepared to discuss this week. This will come up again. In the meantime, let's jump directly into some of the other civilizations we wanted to look at. First, I'd like to look at the Vedic peoples once again, who I already mentioned a little bit earlier, because they offer as a big contrast from some of the empires we talked about last week. The Vedic society, as you may remember, were a chariot riding and pastoral farming group who, during this time period, while again the Assyrians and Persians were active, were mainly united by a common language and culture instead of a united political system. So essentially, in simple terms, what does that mean? As I again give an awkward pause while I stare at the camera. Or in this case, drink a glass of water so I don't lose my voice. Tomato, tomato. But yeah, to put this in more simple and less historical terms, potentially, this essentially means that everyone in this Vedic civilization, as we would call it, they all speak the same or a similar language. They have a similar cultures, practices, and religion, but there is no government that unites them all together. They're essentially smaller independent cities and tribes. So, how is that maybe going to make them look different than the other civilizations and empires we've looked at? Alright, yes, again, very good, class that's hopefully watching this in the future. They're going to be much less centralized. Instead of forming a large empire and spreading and conquering many places, they're much more divided. Well, there is going to be conflict. They're not as going to be collectively working together and exerting their political authority. Big reason for this. The Indus River Valley, as we talked about a little bit in our climate change lesson, they had no established urban centers or political system for the Vedas to build from. There were no other civilizations around that they could really replace. Now, why would that matter and why would that be significant? All right. As you may have already figured it out, but to help a little bit, I like to use this certain analogy, especially for those of you who are really into cars. Which is easier, to build an entire car from scratch or to restore and improve an old car? Now, unless I'm totally off my mark, as many of you probably would guess, it's probably going to be easier to restore an old car than to just build one from scratch. You don't have to go out and get all the parts. You don't have to build everything just from scratch. You already have an existing product to work upon that instead of just making entirely new, you just have to improve. If the Vedas had an older civilization to build from, they might have already had political practices to copy. They would have had some sort of established roads, established armies, different kinds of infrastructure that they could just build off of. However, since the Indus River Valley, because of, as we discussed last time, had all of these ecological issues, the Vedas had nothing to build from and essentially had to start from scratch much later than a lot of other civilizations did. However, despite this, their culture did spread quite rapidly. For example, we looked at this a little bit last week. They had the Vedas, which are their Vedic hymns. These were songs primarily focused upon the various gods and horses of Vedic society. For example, some of their songs would talk about how storms were galloping across the heavens and how thunder sounded like the neigh of horses. Think back to what kind of society this was. Why would the Vedas be so obsessed with horses? Remember, yeah, they're chariot riding and pastoral farming. So essentially they're nomadic people that rely upon horses. So like many cultures, when horses are very important to their survival, they therefore become very important for their religion. The Vedas did also encounter some South Asian indigenous people who were there before the Indo-European migrations. They spread religious beliefs while also absorbed local customs. Now, really quick, how does this show the significance of migration again? Hopefully this is fairly obvious. But yes, very good. Again, future classes hopefully watching this with rapt attention. This shows how migration is not only just responsible for replacing different cultures or just entirely taking away new cultures, it leads to a blending that leads to more modern religions that we're a bit more familiar with. They didn't just go in and completely replace the local religions, and they didn't just completely steal the local religions. They would spread their religious beliefs while also picking up local customs as well to create something entirely new. It's a big reason why migration is such a significant part of history. It doesn't just destroy something or replace something or take away something. it creates new things. Examples some of you might be a bit more familiar with. As many of you probably know, in Greek mythology, Zeus comes across as a bit of a player, to put it very mildly and very more maybe college and high school age friendly. This isn't just how, as some people might not know, according to many mythologists and Greek historians, this isn't just because the Greeks had dirty minds, as we would say. A big part of this is argued is that when Zeus, the religion of Zeus and worshipping the Greek gods was spreading, when it came to a new region that hadn't worshipped Zeus before, in order to make this more acceptable and for the people to be more understanding of this new religion, they would look at it and say, oh, we already have this great male and female god here. Oh, this is just when Zeus came in and seduced another lady. So again, you see here, instead of just entirely replacing a religion or bringing in something entirely new, local people would fit it into their understanding of religion that they already had. The Vedas essentially were doing the Vedic people were essentially doing the same thing when their religion spread throughout South Asia. A couple of ideas of what their society was like. They did establish trade routes to the northwest to access horses very quickly, because again, horses are very important to them. They did use native technology to improve their farming, allowing them to become settled farmers and use the iron plow. They grew barley, millet, cotton, and rice paddies throughout the various portions of their civilization. Now, to review a little bit about why trade and things like this are so important for civilizations. How does having a growing agricultural surplus improve your civilization as a whole? Yes, very good again, imaginary class that was paying attention early on. Once these civilizations are able to become settled and start to have more of an agricultural surplus, instead of just having to worry about how they're not going to starve to death every day, they're able to divert their attention to other things, build more impressive structures, set up more complex societies and cultures, and essentially allow a more developed civilization to grow. Despite the fact that the Vedic were a bit behind other groups, this was no exception for them. For example, their clans and social hierarchies started to get more complex during this period. By this time, the Vedic people started to organize into more regional governments and kingdoms centered around clans. So despite the fact that they still weren't a unified empire or a unified government, they were starting to organize within specific regions. These clans are split up into essentially two groups. You had the Vedic clans that accepted the language and the culture, were considered prestigious and insiders, and you also had the non-assimilated clans, which were considered outsiders. Now, why do you think there would be a difference here? Alright, this again will probably be pretty useful for you who are already a little bit familiar with how government setup and government propaganda often works. If you have these insiders who are given benefits, it can encourage some people to accept your language and your culture and connect your civilization together. If you have these non-assimilated people, it also ensures that you're going to have people who are a little bit lower on the social ladder who will be the ones who produce and do a lot of the manual labor for the rest of the civilization. So essentially you have these privileged insiders who benefit from the system and the ones who don't benefit but are the ones who keep the whole system running essentially. Keep that in mind. That's a very common reason for a lot of these civilizations to create social hierarchies in the first place. You have to have powerful people who are loyal, but you also have to have less powerful people who you're able to use to produce the things you need to survive. One other interesting idea during this time period was the Varna. As I mentioned, once you're able to have an agricultural surplus and have a more variety of jobs and productions, your social hierarchy and class system also tends to get more detailed. During this time period, the Varna was established, which is named after the Sanskrit word for color, was the new Vedic social distinctions, which were established sometime after 1000 BCE. As you may have guessed, this translation implies that for one of the earliest times in world history, class systems are being set up based upon race. So this is one of the earliest instances of a racial class system. The Varna was based off of a religious reasoning, as you might expect. It was believed, according to the Vedas, the hymns, that the gods of their world had initially sacrificed a god named Purusha, who is believed in various religions to be the god of consciousness, cosmic being itself, and or the universal principle. Essentially, he's kind of like, you could argue, he's kind of like Ymir from Norse mythology. He's the thing that was killed that everything else came from. All of the creation came from. So essentially, he's the source of all consciousness and sense of self. Pretty interesting idea, I do think. But like I said, he was sacrificed and his body was used to create the universe. Also, from his body parts, we got all the different classes and peoples that eventually populated the earth. From his mouth, the Brahmins, the priests, were created, and from his arms, the Kshatriyas were created, who are the warriors. Now, we've talked about examples of this a little bit earlier, but to bring it up again, why would both of these groups be the top of your hierarchy? Yeah, very good, and this is essentially very similar to the Assyrians, which you hopefully remember from last week. Essentially, you have the priests at the top of the social ladder because they're the ones who can claim to be the representatives of the gods and give your government authority, while the warriors have to be kept loyal because they're the ones who actually do the dirty work to keep your regions and your kingdom's power. So you have on the one hand the Brahmins providing spiritual authority, the Kshatriyas provide physical, violent authority. The thighs came next, which were the Vaishyas, or the commoners. The feet produced the Shudras, the laborers, and the servants. Now, really quick, the symbolism behind each body part is pretty interesting, I think. For example, you have the Brahmins represented by the mouth, because they are the mouthpieces of the gods. They speak on behalf of the gods. The arms come from the Kshatriyas. Excuse me, I've been talking all day. I'll get it together eventually. But the Kshatriyas come from the arms and are the warriors, representing the strength of this god and of the society. And at the very bottom, you have the feet, considered the dirtiest and lowest part of the body, which represent the lower laborers and the lower servants. So essentially, there's even being thought put into what body part represents each class. Now, just to give you to get you thinking a bit more about how this culture worked, why do you think a creation narrative can be so useful in establishing a social hierarchy? Why is religion itself very useful for this? I'll take a sip of water as I wait for the answer that's not coming. Excuse me. But yes, very good, future class. Remember, these are a very deeply religious people. If you're able to convince them that their religion and their gods are the ones who want this social order to exist, excuse me, many people, again, especially if they're deeply religious, aren't going to be willing to rebel against this. So again, if you have this whole creation narrative explaining why the world is the way it is, many people aren't going to be willing to challenge it. Religion and unity also did increase during this time period, as you would imagine. By 500 BCE, the Vedic people had published the Upanishads, which were a collection of their religious works that explain some of their religious beliefs. Couple of important ideas. The Vedic people believed that all living things were united in a cosmic universe, which they called the Brahma. They believed Atma, eternal being, existed in all living things and united us. They therefore believed that because of Atman, all living things would be reborn into new lives, and that humans could be reborn as new humans, or animals, or plants, or even in some traditions be reborn as gods. Now, why would these religious beliefs in particular, you think, do such a good job at uniting people and spreading across the world? Alright, as you might guess, these religious beliefs have sort of a universal appeal. They don't really deny any other gods, and as you might guess, they're very popular parts of many various religions that came later. They're very simple, easy to understand, and just involve simple cycles of rebirth that can be common in many religions. So essentially, it's not anything that excludes other religious beliefs. Lastly, we're going to wrap things up by looking at the emergence of the Zhou Empire in China. The Zhou Empire replaced the Shang civilizations in 1045 BCE. To review just what we talked about just now, how does this contrast from the Vedic peoples? Yeah, I guess I'll stare at the camera. I never know where to look at during these awkward questions. But yeah, remember again what set the Vedic people apart. The Vedic people had nothing to build off of when they made their civilization. The Zhou did, which meant they got much more developed much more quickly. Couple of factors in their rise. One, you had the emergence of a great leader, King Wu. As you might remember from last time, it's very important a lot of times to have a very charismatic world leader if you want to establish a territorial state that covers a lot of territory. They also had a great military advantage, about 45,000 troops in bronze armor with approximately 300 war chariots. By 1045 in the Battle of Niue, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, King Wu defeated King Zhao of the Qing dynasty and established the Zhao dynasty. So keep that in mind as well, and think about some of the reasons this civilization was launched in the first place. But in order to save time, let's go ahead and move on. Couple of things to keep in mind about the Zhao, if I can get my head out of the way. The Zhao political policies were essentially set up by copying and innovation. Remember, like I said, the Zhao weren't building a civilization from scratch. They had the advantage of being able to build off of things that were already there. So, for example, they copied the patrimonial ancestor worship of the Shang dynasty. Instead of just coming up with a whole new religion to unify people, they just spread the same idea that a ruler's authority passed down from the male ancestors and stretched back and connected to the gods, and they continued the practice of deifying rulers upon death, which, if you remember from last time, is typically a very useful religious and political system because no one's really willing to go against somebody if they buy into a religion that believes that these kings are going to eventually become gods. Interestingly, this led to some new terminology that led to a new kind of Chinese identity. As the Zhao started to spread across various portions of China, they came up with new words to describe themselves. For example, the term Huaxia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, came up for the first time, which essentially just translates to Chinese. This is a new term to describe all the people who lived in Zhao territory. They also came up with a term called Zongguo, which I'm almost definitely not pronouncing correctly, which translates to the Middle Kingdom, and is a term used to describe all of Zhao geographical territory, and is a term that you still use to describe China today. Now, again, comparing back to some of the first territorial states we talked about, what does this new terminology demonstrate? How are people's sense of self and their identity starting to change? And also, why is this such an effective policy to have by the Zhao? All right, very good again, imaginary class. This is, again, very similar to some of the first civilizations we talked about. Instead of just starting to think of themselves as the citizens of one tiny city or one city-state, people are starting to connect themselves to something much bigger than themselves. Now, instead of just being the citizen of Shanghai, a citizen of Beijing, or any other Chinese village or city, they are now citizens of the Zhao Kingdom and citizens of China. So now in China, for the first time, like other places in the world, they're starting to have a much larger national identity and starting to behave in a more unified manner, instead of just being like the Vedic people and just allying themselves to small regional governments. Sense of identity is starting to get much larger. To get a little bit more of what the Zhao was like, we'll look at some of their expansion and innovation. They did have quite a bit of territorial expansion, eventually coming from all the way from present-day Beijing all the way south to the Yangtze River Basin. One of their political innovations was mixing old dynasty lords and new lords from the Zhao Empire to govern portions of their empire. Loyalty would be ensured by giving gifts and land that would be passed down through the generations, and all lords in return were required to give military, agricultural, and monetary tribute to the emperor. Now, why do you think the Zhao would actually allow this mix of old and new lords? Why not just get rid of all the old lords entirely and just replace it with all your new people? As I stare at the camera awkwardly. But yes, future class, very good job. It's essentially all about ensuring loyalty and making this large empire easier to run. Instead of trying to rule everything yourself and killing all your old rivals, you allow some of these local rulers to live, helping to ensure the loyalty and their loyalty and the loyalty of their subjects. And it also means that you don't have to rule everything directly yourself. You delegate some of your authority, so instead of having one person trying to control everything in this vast territory, it's the authority and the decision making it spread out a bit. Much easier and much better at ensuring loyalty. There were also quite a few agricultural innovations worth mentioning. It was during this period that iron plows also arrived in China. You also had crop rotation being practiced in China, which, by the way, what is that and why is it such a good idea? If you're a bit confused on that one, keep in mind what the Dust Bowl was like in America, for example, and why crop rotation became more of a thing after that. I'll stare at the camera awkwardly again. But yes, very good, especially that this might be easier for some of you who are more familiar with farming techniques. If you grow the exact same crop in the exact same place for an extended period of time, you'll eventually drain the soil of the nutrients needed for that crop, and the soil is essentially going to be useless. However, if you grow different types of crops over the years in the same place, you can basically rotate what nutrients are being used in the soil and keep the soil from drying itself out. Canals were also produced during this time period, allowing for much easier water transportation, allowing for the expansion of trade, and irrigation networks were established, which allowed for the growing of crops and provide many more resources. Finally, we're going to look, of course, at the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was popularized in China during the Zhou dynasty and is mainly credited to King Wu's younger brother, who you can see here, whose name was Zhao Gong. He came up with, like I said, the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate of Heaven was this belief that the heavenly powers only gave the right to rule the Chinese to their chosen representatives on earth. Essentially, a ruler was duty-bound to uphold the heavenly principles of honor and harmony for his people. Failure to do so would result in the loss of the mandate, and his government was basically free to be overthrown. Now, why would this belief be useful for the Zhou people? Yeah, it's basically just another example of how theocracies are used to justify authority. If the Zhou dynasty can convince their subjects that they are the ones responsible for providing protection and stability to China, it's going to make people reluctant to revolt against them or to disobey them, because they believe these are the ones who are solely responsible for protecting them. Also, it could just justify their existence, because if they haven't been destroyed or haven't been defeated, it implies that they still possess the Mandate of Heaven and have the right to rule. As we continue throughout the semester, we're going to discuss the Mandate of Heaven a few times in China. Keep in mind whether or not it's a good belief system. To give you a more specific example, it was used by the Zhou dynasty to justify them taking over from the Shang in China. The Zhou argued that because they were morally superior and the Shang were wasteful and corrupt, they had the right to overthrow the Shang dynasty. This Mandate of Heaven is going to be thrown around many times as dynasties change in China. Now, to give you a bit of more of an idea of how they preserved the Mandate of Heaven and kept people on board with it. One of the things they did was have precisely calculated astronomical calendars and predictions about agricultural growth and agricultural products. They calculated the length of a solar month and a solar year, getting it down to pretty accurate numbers. They also calculated the length of a lunar year, and were the ones who actually created the leap month and eventually leap day. Now, why is this going to be such an important part of the Mandate of Heaven? As you might guess, it was essentially used to prove that they did actually have the Mandate of Heaven, and heaven and the gods were on their side. If they weren't able to predict the year accurately, and more importantly, predict how the agriculture was going to go that year, it would be hard to convince people that heaven was on their side and guiding their actions. But if they're able to make accurate predictions, it makes it look like they are able to divine what heaven wants and are doing a good job of representing the gods. Bronze ritual vessels were also produced during this time period, which were taken from the Shang, and they were often made using forced Shang tribute labor. This would again demonstrate the Mandate of Heaven, because not only do you have the corrupt people you replaced serving you, you also have again these great ritual vessels which are displaying your power and your devotion to the gods once again. Lastly, we will look a little bit at the Zhou social order. The hierarchy was very simple and similar to many other groups we've looked at. The Zhou emperor and his ministers were at the top, the regional lords and nobles were at the middle, then you had the various ministers, administrators, and common people on the bottom. Common people hierarchy. They originally mostly worked as farmers for the massive landowning families. Does that sound like anything maybe from European history, for example? Look at the Middle Ages, for example. Yes, very good. Future class that hopefully answered this. This is very similar to European feudalism. You just have a few families working for one lord and supporting them economically in return for protection. Eventually, this class social order became class structured and was based more upon things like breeders, artisans, merchants, and various types of growers. This again demonstrates, like the Vedic peoples, that their civilization had developed to the point where they could have a very diverse class system, and it wasn't just a couple of overlords ruling over everybody. Gender roles were also very similar to other civilizations we've looked at. The men typically just farmed and hunted, while the women fashioned clothing, as you can see here. However, rich women were eventually allowed more freedom because of the wealth they were able to possess. Very simple way to put that. Teaching these lessons all day gets a bit old, like I said. But yeah, that's essentially the basic Zhao social order and social structure. Alright, so again, another thing I want you to keep in mind for really the rest of the semester is typical ways that some of these empires and territorial states could be ruled. Over the past couple of weeks, we've looked at two major types. First, you'll have the absolute control empires we talked about last time. You can see the Neo-Assyrians and the Persians. You can have a decentralized regional lord sort of structure, like the Zhao dynasty, where you essentially allow a lot of local rulers to do the work themselves. Or you can have the other extreme and have social religious unity, like the Vedic peoples, where you essentially have no empire and no central state, and you're just united by your culture. As we continue throughout the semester, think about which of these systems is actually going to be the best idea. In the meantime, please again do remember your assignments coming up. If you have any questions about them, let me know as soon as possible. But in the meantime, have a great week, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.